more court news yesterday in this fascinating Virginia case, Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax, that the Supreme Court decided not to take up in a big decision yesterday. That actually the decision not to take up this case involved dissents. Alito and Thomas wrote a dissent on the court's decision simply not to take up the case. Let's put this first tear sheet on the screen. This is from the New York Times. The headline, Supreme Court won't hear new case on race and school admissions. The decision, along with an order this month declining to block West Point's admissions program, suggests that most justices are not eager to immediately explore the limits of its ruling from June. We can move on actually and put this next tweet up on the screen. This is from Ed Whalen, who's someone fairly big in conservative legal circles. And he noted that this reflected, from his position, a timidity among the conservative court justices in taking up certain cases, so deciding which cases to make determinations on and to weigh. That might seem kind of crazy to people on the left who would say, well, this court took up Roe, it took up the Dobbs case, and then made a sweeping judgment on Roe, which didn't have to be the case in Dobbs. It didn't have to completely overturn Roe, and it did. So there's a lot going on here. This is, again, this is a case out of Virginia. I just want to talk a little bit about it. So they ruled back in June on Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. And you know, there's a petition, or there's a coalition, it's called the Coalition for TJ, that's based out in Virginia, who said because they didn't take up this Thomas Jefferson High School case, it might mean little if schools could accomplish the same discriminatory result through race-neutral proxies. And that is an interesting segue into the argument about the TJ policies. Which, just to get into a little bit, the school says are both race neutral and race blind. Their new policy was not designed to produce and did not in fact produce a student population that approximates the racial demographics of Fairfax County or any other predetermined racial balance. The Times notes after the changes went into effect. So this is, again, using, according to critics, proxies instead of directly using race, using factors that are sort of the wink-wink, determination, the wink-wink proxies for race in order to, according to critics of the policies, create the same racial outcomes. So the Times notes, after the changes went into effect in 2021, the percentage of Asian American students offered admission dropped to 54% from 73%. The percentage of Black students grew to 8% from no more than 2%. The percentage of Hispanic students grew to 11% from 3%, and the percentage of white students grew to 22% from 18%. In the Fairfax County school system in 2020, about 37% of students were white, 27% were Hispanic, 20% were Asian, and 10% were Black. Alito's dissent said what the Fourth Circuit majority held, in essence, is that intentional racial discrimination is constitutional so long as it is not too severe. This reasoning is indefensible and it cries out for correction. Even though the new policy bore, quote, more heavily on Asian American applicants, the panel majority held that there was no disparate impact because they were still overrepresented in the TJ student body. That is clearly a mistaken understanding of what it means for a law or policy to have a disparate effect on the members of a particular racial and ethnic group. He sounds a little bit there like critics from the left, actually, of a lot of policies that end up having a disparate outcome, even if they have, equal opportunity sort of policies that even if they're sort of staked on equal opportunity legally, will have a disparate impact in the outcome. Krystal, what did you make of this decision?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more background, as a native Virginian who also attended University of Virginia, I'm very familiar with Thomas Jefferson High School, or TJ, as it is effectively known and affectionately known. It is one of, if not the top public high school in the entire country. It is famously very selective. It takes students from Fairfax County, Alexandria, Arlington, sort of like the Northern Virginia, immediate suburbs. And so it has been very highly selective. And the previous criteria for admittance was basically, there were a number of factors, but it was basically an exam process. And there were a few middle schools in the region that became known as like feeder schools for TJ. And so if you had the money to be able to, live and move into those districts where you could attend those middle schools, you had a huge leg up. So what they decided to do, and this came in the wake of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, which is part of what raised suspicions that this had more to do with racial rebalancing and potential affirmative action than with, this sort of like race blind approach that they are claiming. But what they decided to do is, rather than relying on this exam process, which left a lot of students, there were, I think, 8 middle schools in the region that wouldn't send any students. None of their kids would get admitted to TJ. They decided to adopt something that's actually very similar to what Texas does with regard to their public university system. They said, we're going to look at taking the top students from every middle school. And when we're doing our evaluations, because it's not just your GPA, there are a couple other factors that are considered. So there still is an evaluation process. We are not going to know your name. We're not going to know your race. We're not going to know your gender, so that we can really try to be sure that we're not being discriminatory in any manner. So for me, looking at this as someone who doesn't support racial affirmative action, who is actually glad, that the Supreme Court ruled the way that it did, this is much closer to almost like class-based affirmative action that reflects that, kids who grow up with fewer means in a tougher neighborhood have extraordinary challenges to overcome. And so if they are the top students in that neighborhood, they are still extraordinary and deserving of entrance here. To me, if the Supreme Court had come in and struck down this admissions process just because it somewhat changed the, racial demographics being admitted to the school, that would effectively be saying, well, you can't change your admissions policy ever, no matter what, if it changes the current racial quota whatsoever. So in a way, it would make it, once again, like racially obsessed, like we have to stick to this current, racial quotient that we have right now in the school, and you can't change the admission process whatsoever if it is going to change that at all. So I think it made a lot of sense. I support the fact that they did not decide to intervene here, and that this admissions process, which again, doesn't even allow them to know the race of the kids that they are considering for admittance, and will likely lead to a more broad demographic, not just racially, but also in terms of class representation. I fully support that. And just to reiterate one thing, Emily, that I just said, in Texas, with regards to their public university system, they admit the top, I believe it is 10% of Texas high schoolers throughout the whole state for a very similar reason, to try to have class diversity and other forms of diversity as well, as a reflection of the fact that, depending on the zip code you're in, we wish that everything was equal, but we know that it's not. And if you're coming up through in a certain neighborhood, through a certain school system, you may have additional odds and additional challenges to overcome. So they want to have the total demographic and class dynamics reflected in Texas in their public universities. And I think they're doing a similar thing here with TJ.
The TJ story has been incredible because you have a lot of minority parents who have rallied and in some ways, become affiliated with conservative groups, despite not having a lot of conservative leanings over their frustrations with some of these initial policies. And we've seen that happen with affirmative action cases a lot. The continuing issue that I imagine people like Ed Whalen are talking about is a lot of universities. Hopefully there's some real class diversity that comes through these policies. When I've looked at how some universities have used these proxy policies, it seems like they're still trying to do the same thing with race. Like some of their outcomes look really suspect, rather than like they're using them for the good. But I actually think in paper, I agree with you. On paper, Krystal, I agree with you. These policies should allow for more class diversity, and hopefully that's the case. It doesn't bother me that the Supreme Court decided to stay out of this one, but I think some of the conservative critics are right that deciding to stay out of this one will allow universities to continue making policies like this that could still have similar ramifications to what happened in the Students for Fair Admissions case. But hopefully those policies actually work out better. But it's just depending on how each school determines they should be implemented.
Let me just say one more thing about this, which is that I do really empathize with and I mean, it's mostly Asian parents who are pushing back against this, who feel like Asian kids are being discriminated against, that the sentiment was it's 73% of Asians who are being admitted to this school and it needs to be more representative. Like, if you are that parent who, scrimped and saved and moved into that neighborhood to get your kid in that feeder middle school and do all the test prep, and like you've been lining this up for years and you've been focused on it, and now they're changing the rules of the game. I do deeply, like, that is a lot. I do deeply empathize. So I don't want to pretend like I'm callous to the fact that, you had a plan, you may have sacrificed to try to get your kid into this position, and now you feel like they're being put at a disadvantage. Whereas if they had gone to, a different middle school in a less expensive area, now they'd be on kind of the inside track to get into TJ. And I understand that is experienced and is potentially a genuine loss. However, I do think that just on the face, the fact that the public school board decided we're going to change our admissions policy in this way, that it's important to have the, class and demographic and other demographic characteristics more fully represented, and they're doing it in a way that is race blind. I do think that that's a superior outcome in the long term, even as I understand that for many of these parents, this is being experienced as a real loss and dramatically unfair to them in the short term. And the last thing I'll say about that is, it is a problem in and of itself to have a few middle schools in the county and in the region as like the top middle schools that all of the, wealthy families want to go to, with the top students want to go to. And that creates a self-fulfilling inequality amongst the schools in the whole district. So I also think over the long term, this will likely bring up the level of all of the middle schools in the district as you have more sort of broad sorting across the county. And, that has been shown, studies have shown that having more racial and class in particular of a mix in schools improves the quality of those schools for everyone. So I also think that will likely be an outcome of this policy as well. So in that way, I see it as an improvement. And I'm glad, again, that the Supreme Court did not intervene here and allow them to make this change.
That is such an important broader point. And the last thing that I'll say is I think the Supreme Court decision last June probably did have a chilling effect on how schools are implementing race-blind policies. So hopefully that's some good news for the sake of fairness and justice in this case as well. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.